We're going to get started here. In a little bit, we will have an opening prayer. And Don, when we get to that point, would you lead us in that prayer? So, a quick recap for the last couple of classes. We have been looking at common defenses of macroevolution. Remember, macroevolution is small changes over a large quantity of time accumulate into a change of species, into new kinds of creations. What we saw is some things that were very puzzling. They were very puzzling shortcomings, such as the irreducible complexity of creation today. If you were to work backwards in the evolutionary process, the creatures that we see today wouldn't just be inferior, they wouldn't work. They would be inhibited in such a way that they wouldn't be able to survive, or would be unlikely that they would be adapted to survive. We also saw that radiometric dating has many pitfalls, especially considering the assumptions that are made around radiometric dating. And then we also recognized that just because animals have similar anatomies, that doesn't demand that there's evidence of evolution. We looked at Darwin's finches. We looked at the English pepper moth. We saw how those are all examples of microevolution, small changes within an animal kind, and they do not demand acceptance of macroevolution. But probably one of the biggest problems that we have looked at is the evolutionists' reliance upon the geologic column and the fossil record. And what we saw was, one, there is no place that you can go and see all the layers of the geologic column. It's theoretical. But number two, there is not a single fossil within the fossil record that provides evidence of a transition between simple to complex, undeveloped to developed. And so today, what we're going to do is look at some ways that scientists have tried to fix the puzzle. And they tried to make all the pieces come together and fit just in the right way so that they can say evolution is still the answer. And what I mentioned with the fossil record specifically was that whenever you have a fossil that's out of place, all right, the trilobite. The trilobite was supposed to be in this strata, but we found it in a much older strata that it shouldn't be at. That is not the defeating argument for an evolutionist, because they are biased or presupposed that evolution is a fact. And so all it does is changes aspects of evolution, but there is no doubt in their mind evolution must still exist. The things that come up next are what we're going to be looking at through the course of this class. So that's what we'll be studying. We're going to have our scripture reading real quick, and Robbie, I'll ask you if you'll read this, and then Don will lead us in an opening prayer.
Ephesians 4:17-19. So this I say and affirm together with the Lord, that you walk no longer just as the Gentiles also walk, in the futility of their mind, being darkened in their understanding, excluded from the life of God because of the ignorance that is in them, because of the hardness of their heart, and they, having become callous, have given themselves over to sensuality for the practice of every kind of impurity with greediness.
So I think as we reflect upon that passage, and also we reflect upon the things that we will talk about in today's and other classes coming up, we will recognize the dangers of setting aside God and setting aside His truth of creation, where that leads our minds and some of the problems that is created for the evolutionary world. So, John, would you lead us in an opening prayer?
Holy and most righteous God, Father in heaven, we're grateful to you that you blessed us with our health and the beautiful weather we have and the opportunity we have to assemble together, to worship you and to study your word and to know more about your will for us and how that we can be pleased and acceptable servants. We are grateful for the gift of your Son and for his sacrifice he had to make on the cruel cross so that we could have our sins forgiven, not be lost eternally. We thank you for this opportunity we have to be able to study more your word, to know more about how that we should live and how that we can be prepared to teach others that are lost in sin and that are unwilling to accept your word. We We ask that you continue to be with us and bless us. We ask that will. In Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. So just going on this verse just a little bit further, one particular evolutionist that I hope to be able to get to in today's class was interviewed and discussing what it was about evolution that really captured his excitement and why he was so passionate about it. And he said, it really is my religion. Evolution is really my religion. It tells me everything I need to know about God and about sin and about life. And what he meant by that was God either does not exist or does not care about me. So sin is irrelevant and my life is up to me. It's a very open and honest answer that comes from a life focused on explaining the world apart from God. And so as we think about that, what Paul writes to the Ephesians, he's speaking to Christians, but he is also defining the way the world walks, with minds that are futile and darkened in understanding, ignorance, hardness of heart, greed, all of these different aspects. I think that as we go through some of this, we will pick up even on some of the quotes from some of these professors and doctors and different people in the field that might reveal some of that to us as well. So let me give you a few quotes to get us started down this new path. We're going to have to figure out a way to make everything fit together. So the first one we have is from Dr. Francisco Ayala, who said, I am now convinced from what the paleontologists say that small changes do not accumulate. We kind of ended class on Sunday talking about some of these doctors that were recognizing this. The answer is going to be in the fossil record. And when we got in the fossil record, and we've spent, at this point, coming up on 200 years, 175 years since Darwin proposed the origin of species, we're not finding transitional fossils in the fossil record. And that is being noted by people who are evolutionists. Ian Tattersall and Dr. Niles Eldridge, they are fellow curators of the American Museum of Natural History. And they wrote a report in which they acknowledged, or they admitted, if ever there was a myth, it is that evolution is a process of constant change. Again, these are evolutionists. If ever there was a myth, it's creation, you would expect them to say. But no, if ever there was a myth, it's evolution is something that has been ongoing, non-stop for ever since life began. That's what they're saying, which is what Darwin suggested. This guy, we put a quote from him up last class, Dr. Pierre Paul Grassi. And in the quote that we used last time, he was challenging researchers to not monkey around with the evidence. He says we need to only speak what the fossil record reveals and not try to fill in the blanks. And he wasn't doing that so much as to say we need to protect our integrity. He was doing that to say we're all interested in truth. And if we're interested in truth, we shouldn't try to just make things fit what we think. So here he says, today our duty is to destroy the myth of evolution, considered as a simple, understood, and explained phenomenon which keeps rapidly unfolding before us. As I said, these are all evolutionists. They are not saying, I reject evolution. They still hold that belief. What they're saying is, the evidence that we are finding in the ground when we dig up all of these fossils do not support the mechanisms of evolution that Darwin put forth. The mechanisms which we have all assumed to be true. So the mechanism of time and accumulated change. That mechanism, which is how we get from monkey to man. He says we're not finding any evidence of that. And so that's the aspect of evolution that we need to reject. That's the part of evolution that we need to push away from. He also, this same guy, Dr. Pierre Paul, says the deceit, speaking of evolutionists, the deceit is sometimes unconscious, but not always. People purposely overlook reality and refuse to acknowledge the inadequacies and the falsity of their beliefs. Again, these are men that are saying what we have been espousing for years. There's no evidence to support it. It's unsupported. And it's causing us to be standing on a crumbling foundation. So, what do? That's what we're going to look at today. What do we do? What have scientists done to make the puzzle pieces of this evolutionary worldview still come together and have some sort of cohesive idea that they can hold up as this is a theory, but we are moving forward as if it is a fact? And the first place we're going to begin with is mega evolution. You heard of this one, Robbie? So we've talked about microevolution. We have talked about microevolution and macroevolution, and now we are going to talk about mega evolution. Again, let's go over those terms. Microevolution is the fact that there are small changes within species. So finches get bigger when the environment around them changes and the smaller ones die off. We don't see a new species anymore, we just see changes within the species. Macroevolution is the theory that small changes accumulate over time and create new species. But mega-evolution is the theory that suggests for great periods of time there was no significant evolutionary change, and then suddenly great change occurred all at once. And thus, it is mega. It is a even bigger evolutionary change than macro. This theory comes from scientists like the one that we previously mentioned, who recognize the unreliable nature of classic Darwinianism and Darwinian evolution, and they also specifically are focusing on the fossil record. The fossil record doesn't support these claims, so what do we do with that? In 1940, this guy, Dr. R.B. Goldschmidt, he is a German geneticist, and he is later going to be a professor at UC Berkeley. And he's going to stand on the work of another doctor, Dr. O.H. Schindewolf, who is a German paleontologist. And Dr. Goldschmidt here proposes the idea of hopeful monsters. This is kind of his take on this idea of mega evolution. Now, when he says hopeful monsters, what he's talking about is an extreme version of macroevolution, where a reptile lays its eggs and one of them hatches as a bird. Robbie kind of snickered at that. He is not alone. Many in the scientific community snickered at this. But what they're talking about in Hopeful Monsters is the mutations would have been so extreme. You know, you're expecting a crocodile and a buzzard pops out. Extreme mutation. That's why we're going to call them monsters, because they are monstrous mutations. But we're hopeful because these mutations would have survived, even though 99.9% of the time, large mutations don't end with the survival of the creature. They usually cause its death. But we're going to be hopeful because in these moments, the animals must have survived, and thus they would have been hopeful monsters. This is kind of what he's describing. This new creature that appears on the scene, that is able to flourish, and is able to procreate, and is an entirely new creature from birth. This breaks from traditional Darwinian evolution in great ways. This is a huge deviation. We're getting far away from the things that Darwin taught. And there weren't a lot of people that went mega evolution. I think that's the cart I'm going to hitch my horse to.
Well, wouldn't they be sexual reproduction, or would they be asexual reproduction? Because, a hopeful monster, you'd have to have a female monster at the same time.
Exactly. There's some issues that come up, and that was one of the first ones that I wondered is if this occurred, and maybe this creature is capable of surviving and reproducing, what does it reproduce with? But it either would have to be reproducing with a member of a new species or a different species, or there would have to be multiple of these mutations that happen within the same generation. And so we'll get to some of that, because some of the problems, there's even greater problems than that arise with the view. But there's a reason why a lot of people went, I don't think that I care for this. Even in the evolutionary world, there were those who scoffed and ridiculed Goldschmidt for this belief. But there were others who kind of tried to massage it a little bit. One of them is this guy here, Carl Wosch, who in 2008 just kind of changed the phrasing mega evolution to saltation evolution. You know what saltation is, Robbie?
Well, I mean, not really.
I'd never heard this term before.
Salt and saturation.
So it actually has nothing to do with salt.
Okay.
But I guess saltation is the way that hard minerals are transported. So salt may be a crystallized mineral of sort, but sand also would be the depiction of this. That's what I have on the board here is sand. So, Miss Carol, if you're picturing a beach and the wind blows, and you see the sand is just kind of getting pushed down the beach, but there's a spot in the sand where it's uneven, and it kind of forms a ramp. And so some of that sand gets thrown up into the air, and it goes much farther and lands farther down. That's saltation. Saltation is that being thrown out. And so what they're suggesting is evolution. Here's our lineage, our traditional, but saltation evolution is there was some creatures that just suddenly got thrust way down the evolutionary line by some event that, and again, saltation evolution is one that people have struggled with. There are not nearly as many supporters of this. Both of these are examples of people trying to fit this puzzle together, but they're running into things that seem, at least on the outside, seem implausible. But what I want us to understand about that is what they're doing is they're acknowledging something. Whenever someone comes up and says, I don't believe that Jesus died on the cross and was raised from the dead. There's evidence that there was a man named Jesus. There's evidence that he was crucified on the cross, so I can accept that. But you cannot convince me that Jesus was raised from the dead. In fact, there are people who in Jesus' day said, hey, the body was never buried. The body was just thrown off to the side and animals ate the remains. It's a theory. It's another theory that they're going to bring up. Say this is what we believe happened. But in offering up that theory, what's the one thing that they are doing, that they are agreeing with us on?
That Jesus was here.
That Jesus was here, he died, and we don't know where his body is. Now, that's a whole different class. What happened to the body of Jesus? If all the trouble that was created by this sect of followers who said, we believe that Jesus was raised from the dead, it could have been solved by just one person going, here's his body right here. We can shut this down right now. Why on earth didn't they suggest it? Why didn't they bring that up? So, again, very different subject. But Carl Wosch, Dr. Goldschmidt, others who are proponents of this idea of mega evolution, what I want us to take away from this class is they are admitting something. They are bringing out something that is vital to our understanding of this topic, this debate between evolution and creation, and that is, there is nowhere near the evidence that we have been led to believe for evolution to have existed over great periods of time. They are telling us there's something missing. It was interesting. I was reading a forum preparing for this class, and one of the guys in the forum was saying, I'm still not a young Earth creationist, but I have abandoned evolution because my college professor in biology, was trying to explain to us how the rib cage got from the outside to the inside in turtles. And before he said the first thing about this, he said, please don't mention this to your creationist friends. We really don't know how this happened. And then proceeded to teach the entire class on how it happened. And he said, that was the catalyst for me to say, hey, maybe I need to look into this more. As people are digging more into the facts that are there, what does the fossil record reveal? Even the staunch evolutionist is saying it doesn't reveal what we've been saying for hundreds of years now. It does not reveal gradual change. So, that's mega evolution. We're not done with it, but we're going to change it a little bit. Dr. Niles Eldredge, who I referenced this guy a minute ago, and Dr. Stephen J. Gould. Stephen J. Gould is a doctor that I referenced in the last class. We're going to talk more about him in just a moment. But these two come together to work on a report in which they are examining the very same things that the former guys were looking at. In fact, they're continuing the work of many others. I said that Schindwolf and Goldschmidt kind of got this started in the early 40s, mid-40s. There were others who came and tried to massage it a little bit. They renamed this to quantum evolution. In the 1960s, there's a group of scientists in the Soviet Union, and they begin a research project trying to find out. It's been 100 years now since Darwin wrote his Origin of Species. Why haven't we found a single transitional record? They come to a similar conclusion. It's not exactly the same, but they basically come to the conclusion, well, it must have happened very rapidly or very quickly. But it was in the early 70s that Dr. Niles Eldredge, who's a paleontologist, and again, he's curator of the American Museum of Natural History, and he's working with evolutionary theorist and Harvard professor Stephen J. Gould on the publication Punctuated Equilibria, an alternative to phyletic gradualism. And if those words mean nothing to you, that's okay. They mean nothing to me. Ultimately, what they're saying is an alternative to gradual change within species. And that alternative they're suggesting is this punctuated equilibrium. That's what we're going to talk about. But before I go into this, I want to say, when I reference these scientists, and if you're going to go and take all this and go to your friends and say, hey, but this scientist says this, and this scientist says that. I'm not cherry picking just some random scientist that nobody knows about, and they're really nobody because they hold these weird views, and we're just going to use those to prop up our views. These are people that are incredibly respected in their field as evolutionary scientists. They're respected within the evolutionary field. This guy here, Stephen J. Gould, who passed away in 2002 from cancer, but in his obituary, the New York Times covered his obituary, by the way. It's pretty spectacular, I guess. So here's what they had to say about him. Dr. Stephen J. Gould, the evolutionary theorist at Harvard University, whose research, lectures, and prolific output of essays helped to reinvigorate the field of paleontology, one of the most influential evolutionary biologists of the 20th century and perhaps the best known since Charles Darwin. I'm not just picking somebody out of the blue to say, hey, yeah, this guy had some really wackadoo theories. That's not what we're doing at all. These are respected theories within the evolutionary world. And what they're saying is the fossil record offers no support for gradual change. That's what Dr. Gould came to recognize. And so he comes up, along with Niles Eldredge, and we'll talk about his reasoning behind it for just a second. But they come up with punctuated equilibrium. And punctuated equilibrium is this. Equilibrium is describing the vast eons of time. We're still working with billions of years. But for the vast eons of time, the world was in a sense of stasis. It was stable, it was unchanging. And thus it was equal. It was an equilibrium. And so we have this great hypothesized period of time where just nothing really changed. Everything was just how it was. And that's clear after an exhaustive view of the fossil record that there wasn't all of this change. But in a relatively quick and short period of time, that stasis is punctuated or interrupted by episodes of wild and random and beneficial mutations which create new animal kinds. Now, if you remember, when we say mutations, we're talking about PDS. They're persistent, they're beneficial, and they're structural. So it's going to get passed on to the offspring. Robbie brought up a really good question. Where did that offspring come from? But it's going to get passed on to the offspring. It's going to benefit them to make them greater chances of surviving amongst their competitive species. And it's going to change them physically, structurally, into a new species. So Gold said, I do predict that during the next decade, Goldschmidt, who began this with the mega evolution, will be largely vindicated in a world of evolutionary biology. The fossil record, with its abrupt transitions, offers no support for gradual change. Now again, if I can translate that for our purposes, what he's saying is this: Darwin was wrong, and Darwin's theory does not work. And so we've got to find a new answer. Part of how they came to this new hypothesis for evolution was by studying the trilobite. And in so doing, they see a creature that is incredibly complex, and it's got an eye, a very multifaceted eye, that many believe to be even more complex and even more advanced than the human eye today. The problem was it showed zero signs of evolutionary change over a supposed millions and millions of years. And so this led Dr. Eldridge to conclude that traditional evolution simply cannot be proven by the fossil record. And over time, many other renowned scientists have joined them. They've come aboard this punctuated equilibrium train and sought to look for ways to support this teaching. So we've got about 15 minutes left in class. And what I hope to do with those times is talk about some of the problems with this. But before we get into that, Robbie, you've mentioned one. I'll just ask you all, just off the cuff, with this idea of punctuated equilibrium, what are some problems that arise in your mind? Or what are some thoughts that it drums up for you? We've kind of talked about this is demanding that there is a problem with Darwinian theory. Robbie, you brought up the idea of reproduction, but what are some other things that come to your mind as you reflect upon what these guys are doing and what they're saying?
So they're saying everything was equal, smooth, just calm, and then all of a sudden this happened. Where do they say whatever happened came from?
So that's a great question. Best that I can tell from reading through some of their quotes and some of the things that they have theorized, that we can't really pinpoint when it happened. But what we can do is say, this species is the ancestor. This species over here is the ancestor of this species over here. But we see no gradual change in between. So there must be a period in between them when that species just began. And, maybe, as I said, Goldschmidt was suggesting hopeful monsters, a reptile just gives birth to a bird one day. And some of them suggested as little as 1 year. So if you're trying to account for 4.8 billion years on the earth, 1 year, that's even harder than needle in a haystack at that point. But yeah, that's a great question, is, okay, when did it happen? And we're not for sure. We're just certain that it did happen. Other thoughts?
Well, I mean, if you have a herbivore, and, does that mean the plants that fed that herbivore just appeared at the same time? Or if you had, in nature, everything is balanced.
Yeah.
You have carnivores, you have herbivores, you have decomposers, you have all these different things in nature that balance. So if you just add something to the situation, it takes everything out of balance.
Yes, yes. Yellowstone introduced timber wolves back into the park, something 5-10 years ago. I remember reading this.
It's funny because Jeremiah, neighbor,
Did he?
yeah.
And the havoc that it wreaked on the ecosystem there completely turned it upside down. Now what they found out was there were a lot of creatures there that were probably not as native as they thought, because we do know the timber wolves were native there. Timber wolves had been there in the past. We've got accounts of that. When they brought them back, the timber wolves destroyed a lot of things that didn't have them as a predator. And then there were things within nature. As you kind of bring up this idea of the cycle. You have things that keep certain plants at bay, and then you have animals like predators that keep populations of herds animals down. But over time, all of this change that was brought on by the timber wolves actually changed the course of the Yellowstone River. The Yellowstone River started flowing in a new portion because of all the change that the timber wolves created and bring them in. It is incredibly balanced. And so if we have just a new creature that suddenly appears, and now we've got dinosaurs that have appeared on the earth. Dinosaurs are now here. What does that do to the flora, the fauna? How does that throw it all off? And where is the evidence of that? It's another great question. Any other thoughts? I'll tell you something that stands out to me about this. Is while I don't agree with these men, I've got a lot of respect for them. Because they stood up and said, guys, you guys that are getting up and saying fossil record, it's not there. It's not true. I do not believe that they're on the right path in any sort of way, but they exhibit a scrupulous sort of attitude that says, look, we're about truth. If we're about truth, we need to examine the truth and not add into it. And I hope that reflects our attitudes and our character as well as we go through this. That we don't stoop to some of the same lengths and the same lows that people have in the past to just try to make things look our way, make us look right. We're not about being right. That is not what this class is about. This class is about examining evidences. And yes, we come from a bias that says the Bible is the Word of God, and we have evidence to support that and reason to believe that is true. But truth doesn't fear examination. And so if truth doesn't fear examination, we have no need to try and hide things away. We hope that never comes out. I have no reason to hide and say I don't really have a good explanation for why something has happened in history. Instead, we just want to be truth-seeking people. And I think that's where these men were starting in. Is they're looking and going, if we're seeking truth, this is obviously not true. The fossil record does not suggest that there is any such thing as a transition. And so we're going to have to deal with that, because we know evolution is real, but we now understand that the mechanisms are all wrong. And so we're going to have to go back to the drawing board. And this is where they have landed, and there are several that are joining in with them. Other thoughts before we move on?
Is this the prevalent theory today?
I would say it's not prevalent. I would say Darwinianism is still the prevalent theory. That is what you will find taught still. I don't think you're finding punctuated equilibrium taught in textbooks today, that evolution happened suddenly, abruptly. It's still being taught that it happened over billions of years, and it was a constant event that was continuing and continues even today.
So what's that say? They're still trying to use macroevolution as their theory.
It says if we admit that we were wrong for the past 140 years, that's going to discredit all of our universities, all of these speakers, all of the money that's been poured into this, we have a lot to lose. I think that's what it says. I think it says that we're afraid and we're
not finding truth.
I don't think so. And I think that's why men like this, like Dr. Goldschmidt. You know, Dr. Gold here says, I predict that Goldschmidt's going to be vindicated. That language details that Dr. Goldschmidt in the 40s saying, hey, I'm going to talk about mega evolution because macroevolution just doesn't work. There's nothing to support it. He's been scoffed at to the point that he needs to be vindicated in the eyes of other evolutionists. So I think that there's a sense in which there's some in the field that are going, we do want the truth, but we just cannot remove ourselves from evolution not being a part of that. But we do believe that Darwin was going down the wrong trail with gradual change. So I think that's a big reason why you don't see this being the dominant view, is because it costs too much for people to turn back. And again, going back to Ephesians, or even going to Romans chapter 1, verse 25, they exchange the truth of God for a lie and worship the creature rather than the Creator. It's pride and it's arrogance that I worship my position and I worship my truths and my what I know that is right about this. And if I have to give some of that up, I'm losing everything that I worship. And I mean, just imagine, and I want to say that if somebody could come and give me indisputable evidence that God is not real, there's just no such thing as a God, which again, to prove that there is no God is just as impossible to prove that there is a God. But just say, if somebody could come and do that, it could just prove that. It could show you everywhere, every place, every time, there never has been, never will be a God. That's still going to be really hard to lay down that supposition of that bias of my life that I've lived with forever. These guys are no different. They are being asked, we would be asking them to lay down something that is ingrained into their every thought. But there is a guy that did it. We're going to talk about him if we get to the end of class. So, problems with punctuated equilibrium. Number one problem is time. If evolution happened suddenly, if there was just a long period where it didn't, and then an abrupt period, how long did that abrupt period last? Did it last, as I said, some say 1 year. That has problems. Just like Robbie scoffing at that when I said it, the scientific community did as well. Even the people that suggest it say we recognize it's improbable or maybe even impossible for that to happen. But maybe that's what happened. Others will say, no, it took longer, 1 million years, 10 million years. They have a problem as well. What do you think the problem with 10 million years of mega change, what problem would you come up with that? Besides just it throwing everything out of balance, what problem would you find with fossils? We're searching for transitional fossils over billions of years. If they were all squeezed down into a 10 million year period, if you recall when I put the geological strata up, it would be in one rock layer. Where are they? It's the same, and again, the punctuated equilibrium theorists will say there are no transitional fossils. So, well then that's a problem. Because even for punctuated equilibrium, there has to be a transition. And their response is this. The reason that we don't see a fossil is because they're absent. They're just not there. But that is the very evidence that we're telling the truth and that we are right. Now, not only do we not see fossils, but let me ask this, and I'll ask Robbie specifically. You've taught science for a number of years. What other scientific facts can you prove without a shred of evidence? None. There is not a single one. There's not a single thing that you say, you know what? I've got a hypothesis. I have nothing to base it on. No way to prove it. No way to test it. It must be true. And that is exactly what punctuated equilibrium says. There are no transitional fossils, but this must be true. Dr. Derek Agur, another evolutionary scientist, is quoting Dr. Gould here. He said Gould constantly emphasized that stasis is data. In other words, nothing happening in the fossil lineage is just as important as something happening. Now, I want to suggest I think he's right, but not for the same reason. What he's saying is the fact that we don't see transitional fossils tells us something, and it must inherently tell us that it happened so quick that we just have a new creature without a time for the transitional fossil to ever be found. I don't think that's what it's telling us, but let's go on. The next problem is genetics. Genetics is a huge problem for this. There's a few quotes that I want to read you for this problem of genetics. And some of them are people who are creationists, like this first one. Dr. Alan Hayward, he is an old Earth creationist, so he believes the Earth is much older than I would, maybe others would. But he says that punctuated equilibrium defies everything we know about how genes are passed down. Genes, he says, seem to be built so as to allow changes to occur within certain narrow limits, but also to prevent those limits from ever being crossed. So what he's saying is, genetically, what you're suggesting, reptile going to bird in a very quick time, genetics says that's not possible. Our study of genetics is telling us that the genes go, you can have these changes and you can't go any further, and you cannot also do them in any faster period of time. You have a restriction on the amount of time that it'll take to do all this, is what he's discovered and what is being taught in genetics. This guy, Dr. Sewell Wright, wrote, I have recorded more than 100,000 newborn guinea pigs and have seen many hundreds of monsters of diverse sort, but none were remotely hopeful, all having died shortly after birth. You see, I've studied genetics. I've studied these mutations, 100,000 of them, and I don't have a single one that shows anything that would back up punctuated equilibrium, quick changes in quick succession of time. Another one, Dr. Duane Gish. Dr. Duane Gish is a former Cornell professor. He's a biochemist, and he is a young Earth creationist scientist. Some have dubbed him, I should have wrote it down. He is, they talked about, there's a guy that's been referred to as Darwin's Bulldog. Have you ever heard of this?
Yeah.
So they have, I think it was that they have dubbed him God's Bulldog or Creation's Bulldog. This guy debated a lot of evolutionists. He was a big debater, and he's very wordy, and so I don't have all of his quote up here. But he basically says the genetic apparatus of a lizard is devoted 100% to producing another lizard. The idea that this amazingly stable genetic apparatus could be drastically altered in such a new way that a new organism not only survives, but actually is an improvement over the preceding form is contrary to what we know. It's contrary to everything that we have seen as we've studied this. So I said I wanted to tell you about an evolutionist that became a creationist. This was the guy that I referenced at the beginning when he said evolution was my religion. And it told me everything I need to know about God. His name was Gary Parker. And he starts his career in biology as an atheistic evolutionist. But he becomes a believing creationist after examining evidence for himself. And he's got some amazing and hilarious stories. You can go on Answers in Genesis. You can read some of these. One of them is that he actually worked for a Christian-based college, and he was in the biology department teaching creation, and the Bible department was teaching evolution. And they had a debate between the Bible department and the biology department. They had a public debate over creation versus evolution, and he was taking the side of creation. He's got some really funny stories, but he also has a very comedic response to the evolutionary paradox of punctuated equilibrium. I thought it'd be a great place to end our class on. He says the rearguard neo-Darwinian evolutionist likes to point out the apparent absurdity of hopeful monster evolution and claim that evolution could not happen fast. The punctual evolutionists point to genetic limits and fossil evidence to show that evolution did not happen slowly. The creationist simply agrees with both sides. Evolution didn't happen fast, and it didn't happen slowly. And I think that's a great place to end our class with Dr. Gary Parker. Thank you guys so much. Lord willing, Sunday I hope to get into some other things that are brought up to try to prove, make puzzles fit. So we'll look forward to that.